Jane Eyre 1. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. The cold winter wind had brought summer clouds and a penetrating rain. I was glad because I dreaded coming home with chilled fingers and toes, and was conscious of my physical inferiority to John, Eliza, and George. My cousins not sat around their mama in drawing room before a warm fire. I was sent away with my aunt's admonition that I would not be allowed to join them until I offered a more pleasant. I protested that I had done nothing wrong, but Aunt Rid refused to listen. Hurt by her injustice, I slipped into a small dining room that contained a bookcase. I selected a book and sat in a window seat, concealed behind secured drapery. With a book and solitude, I achieved a rare moment of happiness until my cousins interrupted me. Madame Mope's not in here, yelled John. Jane's in the window seat, declared Eliza, more observant, fearing John would drag me out. I emerged from my seat. He demanded to know what I was doing. When I showed him the book, John snatched it from my hand and told me I had no right to read a book that belonged to him. He hurled the book at me, and I fell, cutting my head on the door. You cruel, weak boy, I cried. John attacked me, pulling my hair. I fought back until the servants intervened. Aunt Reed ordered them to lock me in the red room as punishment. I struggled, but could not break free from the servant's hold. The red room was dark and cold. My Uncle Reed had died in the room 9 years ago. He brought me to his home, Gateshead Hall, after the death of my parents when I was a baby. I had lived there 10 years and still did not feel I belonged. Sad and lonely, I cried myself to sleep. My situation worsened during the following month. I was excluded from the holiday parties. Aunt Reed seldom spoke to me and instructed my cousins not to play with me. One morning in mid-January, Aunt Reed sent for me. The change in her attitude puzzled me. I hesitated before the parlor door, afraid to enter, but I knew I must. Aunt Reed sat on the sofa and a tall green man stood by the fire. Aunt Reed introduced Mr. Brocklehurst. What is your name? Asked Mr. Brocklehurst. Jane Eyre, sir, I replied. Jane does not have the character I would wish, said Aunt Reed. Deceit is her worst fault. Deceit is a sad fault in a child, replied Mr. Brocklehurst. Lowood School will correct her behavior. They discussed the advantages Lowood School provided a child like me. Aunt Reed wanted my education to begin as soon as possible. Mr. Brocklehurst promised to make the arrangements promptly and bid us goodbye. Stung by Aunt Reed's misstatement of my character, I retaliated. I am not deceitful, I cried in a high, savage voice. If I were deceitful, I would say I love you, but I don't. Send me away to school. I hate living here. In 2 days, my possessions were packed for the journey I would make alone. On a cold January morning, I left Gateshead Hall for Lowood, where I would live the next 8 years of my life. Lowood, located in a wooded valley near a small town, was a charity school for orphaned girls. A bell awoke the students each morning before dawn. We dressed in the bitter cold and watched if the water was not frozen. A second bell signaled breakfast. The food served at Lowood was often inedible, and hunger became my constant companion. Strict discipline discipline prevailed in the classroom. Because of my small size, I was placed with the youngest students. At noon each day, we were allowed outside for exercise and play. So several girls were too made from inferior clothes. Our clothes did not protect us from the cold. A fellow student told me Mr. Brocklehurst bought our food and the clothes used to make our uniforms. In April, the weather turned warm, but also brought illness. Poor clothing and hunger took a toll. Most of the girls became ill, and several died. When the townspeople learned of our deprivation, they demanded change. A new superintendent took Mr. Brocklehurst's place, and Lowood became a fine school. I studied hard and rose to the top of my class. When I finished my studies, I accepted a teaching position at Lowood. After I decided to seek work as a governess. I placed an advertisement in the newspaper, and Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield Hall offered. The superintendent wrote to Andrea to obtain her permission. Andrea replied that I could do as I pleased. I accepted Mrs. Fairfax's offer and departed for Thornfield Hall 2 weeks later. I arrived at Thornfield in the middle of the night, numb from the cold and anxious about my new position. Mrs. Fairfax put me at ease, greeting me warmly and serving sandwiches. She was not the owner of Thornfield as I had supposed. The owner was Edward Rochester, and I would be teaching his ward, Adele. After I had eaten, Mrs. Fairfax showed me to my bedroom, tired from my long journey. I fell asleep as soon as I climbed into bed. Eager to see my new home, I went outside early the next morning. Thornfield, located in an isolated valley, was a large mansion with 3 floors. As I surveyed the house, Mrs. Fairfax stepped outside and introduced me to my Adele was 7 years old and had come to Thornfield when her mother could no longer care for her. The library served as our classroom, and I taught Adele until noon. While Adele ate lunch, Mrs. Fairfax showed me the rest of the rooms on the first and second floors were tapestries hung from the ceilings and beautiful rugs covered. So Mr. Rochester rarely visited. Mrs. Fairfax kept the rooms ready to receive him. Quiet and dark, the 3rd floor of Thornfield served as a shortage and was seldom used. We viewed the grounds and surrounding Thornfield from the roof. As we headed downstairs, strange laughter echoed in the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "It was probably Grace Poole," answered Mrs. Fairfax. "She shoes for us and uses one of the rooms." The eerie laugh sounded again. "Grace!" exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax. The door next to me opened, and the seamstress came out. Mrs. Fairfax instructed her to be quieter. Grace curtsied silently and returned to work. Mrs. Fairfax and I continued downstairs for our midday meal. My life settled into a routine, and the weeks passed quickly. Mrs. Fairfax was a pleasant companion, and Adele was an able student. So happy with my situation, I longed to see more of the world. When restlessness overtook me, I walked the corridor on the 3rd floor. Grace Poole's laughter frequently echoed in the hallway. 3 months after my arrival, I gave Adele a holiday and offered a letter for Mrs. Fairfax in town. The 2-mile walk would be a pleasant diversion. I put on my bonnet and cloak and set off on a January afternoon, glad to be free of Thornfield's oppressive sight. A mile from Thornfield, I rested on a fence to admire the landscape. As I watched the moon rise, I heard the sound of an approaching horse. A large black and white dog ran past, followed by the horse and rider. Rising to continue my errand, a sliding sound impelled me forward. The horse had slipped and thrown its rider. I hurried forward to assist the man. "Are you injured, sir?" I asked. "Stand aside," ordered. He was not handsome. His face was dark, with stern features and a heavy brow. He rose awkwardly and looked to his horse. Seeing that he was injured, I offered to go for help. He declined and asked where I lived. When I told him I was a governess at Thornfield Hall, he stared at me curiously before saying goodbye and riding away. After completing my errand, I hurried home. A warm glow shone from and a group of people stood before the fire. Not wishing to disturb them, I went in search of Mrs. Fairfax. She was not in her room, but the black and white dog I had seen on the road was lying under a table. "Whose dog is this?" I asked a servant. "Mr. Rock." "The master is in the parlor with the doctor. Mr. Rochester sprained his ankle when his horse slipped on the road from town." The following morning, I detected a change in Thornfield. The comings and goings of visitors replaced its church-like silence. Adele was difficult to teach that day. Eager to see Mr. Rochester, she frequently ran to the banister for a glimpse of him. When lessons were done for the day, Mrs. Fairfax informed me that Mr. Rochester expected Adele and me to join him for tea. I changed my dress and hurried downstairs. Adele was sitting on the floor. "Here is Miss Eyre, sir," said Mrs. Fairfax. "Let Miss Eyre be seated," ordered Mr. Rochester gruffly. "What do I care if Miss Eyre is here or not?" I said, confused by my reception. Mrs. Fairfax served tea, and Mr. Rochester sat as silent as a statue. Curious how he would act, I also sat silently. Adele broke the silence. "Did you bring Miss Eyre a present?" asked Adele. "Do you expect a present, Miss Eyre?" asked Mr. Rochester. "No, sir," I replied. "I am a stranger and have done nothing to deserve one." "Don't be modest," said Mr. Rochester. "Adele sees much improvement." "Thank you," I said. "You have given me my present." Mr. Rochester asked about my studies at Lowood. I described my courses and showed him my portfolio of sketches, which he studied with a critical eye. Without warning, Mr. Rochester glanced and said, "It's 9 o'clock, Miss Eyre. Why have you kept Adele up so late? Take her to bed." I gathered my things and curtsied. Mr. Rochester bowed stiffly, dismissing us. I put Adele to bed and puzzled over my employer's abrupt behavior. Mr. Rochester rose early to tend to business and visit neighbors, and returned late. I only saw him when those occasions he acknowledged my presence with a cool glance and a distant nod. One evening after dinner, Mr. Rochester sent for Adele and me. He ordered me to sit next to him, and then took the opportunity found it less gloomy. Rochester, sensing my examination, caught me staring at him. "Do you find me handsome?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied candidly. "I beg your pardon. I meant to say that tastes differ, and beauty is of little. You are blunt, responded Mr. Rochester. Tell me more about yourself. Speak. You cannot command me that way, sir, I protested. You're right, he said. My faults are many. I started on the wrong track long ago and have not righted my course. You can still change, sir, I said. It is time to put Adele to bed. Despite Mr. Rochester's fault, I grew to like him over the following weeks. Our conversations made my time at Thornfield happy. Mr. Rochester liked to describe the places he had visited, and I liked to listen. His appearance I now found pleasing. 2 months after Mr. Rochester's arrival, eerie laughter outside my bedroom door woke me. The doorknob turned and someone moaned. Fear raced through my body. Footsteps echoed in the hall, and the door opened and shut. Why was Grace Poole awake at this hour? Afraid to remain alone, I dressed quickly to ruse Mrs. Fairfax. I opened my bedroom door. A candle stood in the hallway, and smoke rushed from Mr. Rochester's bedroom. I dashed to his door. Mr. Rochester was asleep, and flames surrounded his bed. I cried out, but he did not awaken. Grabbing the pitcher from his wash basin, I doused the fire. Is there a flood? He cried. Get up, sir, I said. Someone has set fire to your bed. While I retrieved the candle from the hallway, Mr. Rochester dressed. I described to him what had happened, and told him my suspicion that Grace Poole had set the fire. Mr. Rochester said he would handle the situation and asked me to say nothing about the incident. I returned to my bedroom, but could not sleep. The next morning, I learned Mr. Rochester had gone to visit friends. Curious, I walked past his bedroom and saw Grace Poole chewing curtains. Her presence puzzled me, and I questioned her about the fire. She told me Mr. Rochester had fallen asleep with a candle lit. I detected no guilt in her answer. Why had Mr. Rochester allowed Grace Poole to remain at Thornfield?
Okay. Now, open your book to page 4. Why was Jane glad there was no possibility of taking a walk that day?
Because she dreaded coming home with chilled fingers and toes, and was conscious of her physical inferiority to John, Eliza, and Georgiana.
What did Jane's aunt say, sending Jane away from a warm fire?
Pardon?
What did Jane's aunt say, sending Jane away from a warm fire?
She was sent away with her aunt's admonition that she would not be allowed to join them until she acquired a more pleasant attitude.
Where did Jane go?
She slipped into a small dining room that contained a book.
What happened in the red room?
Jane Eyre's Uncle Red had died in the room 9 years ago.
Who brought Jane to Gateshead Hall after the death of her parents?
Jane's uncle brought her to his home, Gateshead Hall, after the death of her parents when she was a baby.
Okay. 6. Where was Mr. Brocklehurst from?
He is from Lowood School.
How did Jane's aunt describe Jane?
Aunt Red described Jane is deceived.
So what did she say?
Jane does not have the character she would wish. And deceit is her worst fault.
Right. When did Jane leave Gateshead Hall?
In 2 days, her possessions were packed for the journey she would make alone.
So what kind of day was it?
On a cold January morning.
Okay, what kind of school was Lowood?
Lowood, located in a wooded valley near a small town, was a charity school for orphaned girls.
Okay, page 8. How did Jane do in Lowood?
Studied hard and rose to the top of her class.
What did she do after graduation?
When she finished her studies, she accepted the teaching position at Lowood.
And 2 years?
And after 2 years, she wearied of her routine and longed for new experience. Decided to seek work as a governess.
Okay. Who offered her position?
Mrs. Fairfax offered and departed for Thornfield Hall 2 weeks later.
Who was the owner of Thornfield?
The owner was Edward Rochester.
What is Jane supposed to teach?
She would be teaching his ward Adele.
Okay, page 10. Who did Grace pull at Thornfield?
She chooses for Thornfield and uses one of the rooms.
Was Jane happy with her situation at Thornfield?
Yes.
What did Jane want to do?
She longed to see more of the world.
Okay, next page. What happened when Jane was rising to continue her errand?
Rising, continued her errand. A sliding sound impelled her forward, and the horse had slipped and thrown its rider.
Okay, what did the man look like?
He was not handsome. His face was dark, with stern features and a heavy brow.
Okay, whose was the owner of the black and white dog?
It was Edward Rock.
Page 14. What changed in Thornfield from the following morning?
The comings and goings of visitors replaced its church-like silence.
What did Mr. Fairfax say when lessons were done?
When lessons were done for the day, Mrs. Fairfax informed Jane that Mr. Rochester expected Adele and her to join him for tea.
How was Mr. Rochester's attitude?
Pardon?
How was his attitude?
Kind.
Okay, so he talked.
Gruffly.
Page 16. How did Mr. Rochester acknowledge Jane's presence?
Pardon?
How did Mr. Rochester acknowledge Jane's presence?
He said her Adele shows much improvement.
Page 16. How did he acknowledge Jane's presence? 그 어떤 태도로 Jane presence를 그냥 인지했다 그래서
On those occasions, he acknowledged her presence with a cool glance and a distant nod.
How did Jane feel about Mr. Rochester?
Page 17.
Page 16 and 7. How did Jane feel about him?
She grew to like him over the following week,
How about the conversation?
and their conversations made her time at Thornfield happy.
What did Jane hear outside her bedroom 2 months after Mr. Rochester's arrival?
She, afraid to remain alone, she dressed quickly to rouse Mrs. Fairfax. Cautiously, she opened her bedroom
So
door.
what did she hear?
She heard eerie laughter outside her bedroom door,
And
she heard footsteps echoed in the hallway.
what did she also hear?
She heard the doors open and shut.
Okay, so doorknob turned
Yes.
and someone moaned,
Yes.
right? What is coming out of the Mr. Rochester's room?
Smoke rushed from Mr. Rochester's bedroom,
And
Mr. Rochester was lit and flames.
so what did she do?
She dashed to his door.
Okay, page 18. Did he want others to know about the fire?
No, he didn't.
So what did he say?
He said he would handle the situation and asked Jane to say nothing about the incident.
Okay. What was Grace Poole doing in Mr. Rochester's room the next morning?
The Grace Poole chewing curtains.
Okay. What did Grace Poole say when Jane asked about the fire?
She told Jane Mr. Rochester had fallen asleep with a candle lit.
Good.